At 28, they told Lena Ashby she was a widow with nothing. They said the debt on her husband's name erased her claim to the house, the yard, the life she had known. They gave her until the end of the week, with a summer coming on that the old-timers swore would be the worst in a decade. But what nobody in the town of Redemption knew was that her father had given her a gift that could not be signed away on paper. A knowledge of the earth that would keep her alive when the sun tried to kill her. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The territory of Arizona in the year 1883 was a place that measured life in shades of brown and blue. The sky was a merciless, empty blue, and the land was 100 variations of sun-baked brown. From the dusty track that served as the road, the settlement of Redemption looked like a mistake. A handful of wooden buildings dropped onto a landscape that had not asked for them and did not intend to keep them. It was June. The heat had not yet reached its full argument, but it was clearing its throat. A man on a horse, passing through, might have seen the town first, and then, a quarter-mile out, a lone adobe house with a struggling mesquite tree and a woman working beside it. The woman was Lena Ashby, and she was sorting through the last of her possessions in the thin shade of the wall. She moved with a deliberate economy, her hands sure and unhurried as she separated what was hers to keep from what now belonged to her husband's brother, Silas. The distinction was brutally simple. Anything of value belonged to Silas. Anything she could carry on her back was hers. The wagon, the tools, the 2 good chairs, the iron bed frame, these were no longer hers. A cast iron skillet, a wool blanket, a small tin of her mother's sewing needles, and a worn book of poetry were. She placed them on a square of burlap. Beside them, she laid a small, brass-cased thermometer, its glass tube holding a thin, red line. It was the last thing her husband Thomas had bought before the fever took him, a novelty he'd ordered from a catalog, meant to prove how truly hot the summers were. Now it was just another thing she owned. The sound of a wagon interrupted the quiet hum of insects. It was Silas Ashby and Mr. Gable, the town's land agent and general store proprietor, a man whose authority was woven into the fabric of every transaction in Redemption. They did not get down. Silas, a heavier, softer version of his late brother, remained holding the reins, his face set in a mask of aggrieved duty. Mr. Gable, thin and dry as a corn-husk doll, leaned out. "Mrs. Ashby," he said, his voice without inflection. "The deadline was noon tomorrow. We trust your arrangements are proceeding." Lena did not look up from her work. "I am aware of the time, Mr. Gable. It is a matter of the deed," Gable continued, as if explaining to a child. "The debt must be settled. The property reverts to the family, as is right." Silas shifted on the wagon seat. "It's the law, Lena. Tom's debts are on the land. I'm taking on the debt, I take on the land." "I understand the arrangement," she said, her voice flat. She folded a corner of the burlap over the needles. "Good," Gable said, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "Because there is nowhere else for you in this town. The boarding house is full. Every spare room is spoken for. The charity of this community has its limits, particularly for those who do not respect its arrangements." It was a threat dressed up as a statement of fact. She was being erased, not with a shout, but with a ledger entry and a consensus of closed doors. She was to become invisible, and then, "Gone, I will be gone by noon tomorrow," Lena said, finally looking up. Her eyes were clear and steady, and in them, the 2 men saw no fear, no pleading, no anger. They saw only a calm that they could not interpret, and it unsettled them. They left her there, a lone figure in the encroaching heat, a problem they considered already solved. She had not moved on. She had simply moved her attention. The wagon's dust settled back onto the road, a fine brown powder that coated everything. Lena watched it go, then turned her gaze toward the jagged line of canyons to the east, a place the people of Redemption spoke of, with a mixture of fear and contempt. The Broken Jaw, they called it. A maze of red rock and scrub, rattlesnakes and dead ends. Nothing out there but heat and lizards, was the town's consensus. A man could die of thirst in an afternoon. They believed the canyon was a furnace, an anvil on which the sun beat down without mercy. They were not entirely wrong, but they were not entirely right either. Her refusal to leave the property by the appointed time was not an act of defiance so much as a recalibration of her timeline. The men in the wagon believed her world had shrunk to what she could carry on her back. They were mistaken. Her world was about to expand into the one place they had already dismissed. For the next 2 days, she was a ghost. She was seen by no one, because no one was looking for her. The assumption in town, passed over coffee at Gable's store and over mending in the church hall, was that she had walked the 10 miles to the next settlement of Harmony, or had been taken in by some passing freighter out of pity. Silas Ashby moved his own family's sparse belongings into the house he now owned, his wife Martha pointedly not looking toward the small pile of Lena's abandoned things near the road. The community's judgment was quiet but absolute. Lena Ashby was gone, and the natural order had been restored. On the 3rd day, a mule freighter named Everett Shaw, a man who lived on the periphery of the town's social world, stopped his train on the road. He was a widower himself, lean and quiet, his face a landscape carved by sun and solitude. He had known Thomas Ashby, and he had a passing acquaintance with Lena. He saw the small, pathetic bundle of her belongings. He dismounted and walked to the house. Martha Ashby answered his knock, her face guarded. "Looking for Lena," Everett said, his voice a low rumble. "She's gone," Martha said quickly. "Moved on. Where to?" "We don't know," she said, her eyes not meeting his. "She just left." Everett Shaw knew the people of this country. He knew the difference between a person who had moved on and a person who had been vanished. He looked from Martha's strained face to the vast, shimmering heat rising from the direction of the broken jaw. He felt a cold knot of pity, another soul ground down by debt and bad luck. He turned to leave, then paused. The small brass thermometer lay half buried in the dust. He picked it up, wiped it on his sleeve, and saw the red line pushing 102 degrees. It was only 10 in the morning. He slipped it into his pocket, a strange impulse to save this one small, precise thing. He had seen the last of her, he thought. The town had made its decision, and the desert would ratify it. But as he mounted his lead mule, he noticed something odd. A set of footprints, small and deliberately placed, leading not down the road toward Harmony, but east, directly toward the mouth of the canyon. They were already beginning to blur in the wind, but they were undeniably there. The town believed she would be gone by the first peak of summer heat. Lena Ashby, however, was already making calculations they could not imagine, guided by a principle buried deeper than any well. The knowledge had come to her not in a classroom or from a book, but from the earth itself, mediated by her father. He had been a well digger and stonemason in the green, rolling hills of eastern Texas, a man who understood the world through its weight, texture, and temperature. He did not have words like thermal inertia or geothermal gradient, but he knew their truths in his hands and bones. He knew that 10 feet below the surface, the earth held a memory of winter's cool all through the blaze of summer, a steady, reliable 58 degrees. He called it the deep cool. Lena had been 10 years old, a skinny girl with scraped knees, sitting on the edge of a well he was digging. It was a sweltering August day, the air thick enough to drink. Above, the sun was a hammer. But from the dark circle at her father's feet, a gentle coolness rose, smelling of damp clay and stone. He had looked up at her, his face streaked with mud, and smiled. "Feel that?" he'd asked. "That's the breath of the earth, Lena girl. It never gets hot down there. Never gets cold, neither. The world can be burning up or freezing over, but the deep cool, it just waits. It's patient." He had her lower a bucket with a wet cloth inside. When it came back up, the cloth was shockingly cold against her cheek. He explained it to her in his simple, physical terms. The earth was a great stone, he'd say. It takes a long, long time to heat a great stone, and a long, long time for it to give that heat up. The sun could bake the topsoil for 100 years, but it would never reach the heart of the stone. He taught her to read the land for its secrets. He showed her how a north-facing cliff held the morning chill long into the afternoon, how a trickle of water disappearing into a rock fissure was a sign of a hollow space beneath, a place where the earth was breathing. Most folks build on top of the land, he'd told her, stacking fieldstones for a springhouse foundation. They fight the heat with shade, and the shade is never enough. The smart way is to build with the land. Or better yet, in it. Let the earth do the work. She had stored these lessons away without knowing their value, like smooth, cool stones collected from a riverbed. They were just things her father knew, part of the quiet, competent world he inhabited. When she married Thomas and moved to the Arizona Territory, a land so different from the humid green of her childhood, the lessons had seemed distant, irrelevant. Here the great enemy was not just heat, but dryness. The logic seemed different, but as she stood at the entrance to the broken jaw, the hot wind pulling at her hair, she felt a flicker of her father's certainty. She had followed a nearly invisible trail of greener scrub, a sign of subsurface moisture, until it led her to a narrow fissure in a wall of red sandstone. And from that fissure, she felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible exhalation of cool, damp air. The breath of the earth. For 3 days, she had believed in that breath. Now, she had to make it her home. It was one thing to remember her father's words, it was another to stake her life on them. Belief and knowledge were not the same. Belief was the memory of the cold cloth on her cheek. Knowledge would be the reading on a thermometer, hung in the dark, after a day of 110-degree sun. Her first task was to make the opening navigable. The fissure was barely wide enough for a child, a jagged crack in the rock face hidden by a thicket of catclaw acacia. She spent the first day with a length of scavenged iron pipe, prying away loose rock, her hands quickly blistering and then bleeding. The work was slow, brutal, and utterly methodical. She timed her labor by the sun, working in the cooler hours of early morning and late evening, resting during the peak heat in the shallow shade of an overhang. By the end of the second day, she had an opening she could squeeze through sideways. Inside, the world changed. The roar of the sun was replaced by a profound, echoing silence. The air, which had been a dry, searing blast outside, was now still, cool, and heavy with the scent of damp stone and mineral earth. It was not a single cavern, but a series of interconnected chambers and passages, carved by ancient water. The floor was uneven, a mix of sand and fallen rock. She chose the largest chamber, roughly 15 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a ceiling high enough for her to stand upright. It was here she would make her stand. Her survival system would have 3 components: control of temperature, management of water, and the preservation of food. The temperature was the most critical. The cave's natural coolness was its primary asset, but it was not static. It breathed. She spent hours just sitting in the dark, feeling the subtle currents of air, tracing them to their source. She found 2 small openings high up in the ceiling of the main chamber, which let out the warmer air, and a larger, lower entrance in a deeper chamber that seemed to be drawing air in. This was her engine. She used a mixture of mud and small stones to seal all the other small, useless fissures, wanting to channel the airflow, not stop it. She needed to control the exchange of air with the outside world. Using scraps of her blanket, she fashioned a crude flap for the entrance she had widened, a way to trap the cool air inside during the hottest part of the day. Water was the second pillar. A steady, patient drip, a sound like a slow clock ticking in the darkness, led her to a seam in the rock face in the deepest, lowest chamber. The water collected in a small, naturally hollowed-out basin of stone, clear and shockingly cold. It was barely a trickle, but it was constant. She calculated it, nearly a gallon every 8 hours, enough to drink, and enough for the third part of her system. Evaporative cooling. She hung strips of burlap, scavenged from the pile Silas had abandoned, across the main entrance. Using a cup, she painstakingly wet them with water from the seep. As the hot, dry air from outside was drawn through the damp fabric, it would cool significantly, amplifying the cave's natural advantage. It was a simple principle, but one that could mean the difference between 90 degrees and 105. Finally, food. She had brought with her a small sack of beans and cornmeal. She knew it would not last. For storage, she dug a pit in the sandy floor of the coldest, deepest part of the cave, lining it with flat stones. This would be her larder, her root cellar in the rock, where the Earth's unwavering 58-degree temperature would keep her meager supplies from spoiling. The work was relentless. Her body ached with a fatigue she had never known. But with each completed task, a sense of grim satisfaction grew. She was not merely hiding from the sun. She was building a machine, a simple, elegant machine for living, powered by the patient physics of the earth her father had taught her to read. She was not a victim waiting to be rescued. She was an engineer in the middle of a complex and critical project, and the deadline was the rising sun each morning. The first true test came a week after she had entered the canyon. The day had been brutal, a shimmering, white-hot glare that bleached the color from the sky. The temperature in the shade of the cliffs had reached 112 degrees by mid-afternoon. The rocks themselves were too hot to touch, radiating heat like a smith's forge. Inside her chamber, Lena waited. She had her system in place. The entrance flap was down, the burlap strips at the main passage were damp, and the air was still. The only light came from a single tallow candle, its small flame a steady point of yellow in the immense dark. Propped on a ledge of rock was the brass thermometer she had salvaged. Throughout the day, she had watched the thin red line. Outside, it would have been climbing relentlessly. Here, it had barely moved. As dusk fell and the oppressive heat of the day began to slowly radiate away from the land, she unpinned a corner of the entrance flap and stepped into the main passage. The air that greeted her was not the cool, still air of her sleeping chamber, but it was tolerable, perhaps 85 degrees. She walked to the mouth of the cave. The hanging burlap strips were nearly dry. The air moving through them was warmer now, but still a relief compared to the wall of heat that met her when she pushed the final flap aside and stepped into the twilight. The desert air was like opening an oven. It was still over 100 degrees, a residual, suffocating blanket of warmth. She stood for a moment, letting the contrast sink in, feeling the sweat bead on her forehead almost instantly. She turned and went back inside, the coolness of the cave wrapping around her like a damp cloth. She made her way back to her inner chamber, the heart of her system. The candle flame flickered as she passed. She picked up the thermometer. She held it near the candle, the light glinting on the brass casing. The red line was precise, unforgiving. It registered 72 degrees. 72. Outside, a slow, baking death. Inside, the coolness of a spring morning. It was in that moment that belief became knowledge. The memory of her father's voice, the feeling of the cold cloth on her cheek as a child. Those were echoes, theories. This was proof. A number, written in red, undeniable, a wave of emotion, so long held in check by the sheer effort of survival, washed over. It was not joy, not quite. It was a profound, aching sense of connection. She saw her father's face, streaked with dirt, looking up from the bottom of the well. She understood now, not just what he had said, but what he had known. He had known the deep, abiding trustworthiness of the physical world. He had known that if you understood its rules, it would not betray you. Laws made by men, like the ones Gable and Silas had used to dispossess her, were fickle and cruel. The laws of thermodynamics were absolute and fair. She pressed her palm against the cool, solid stone wall of the cave. The earth did not care about deeds or debts. It did not judge. It simply was. And for the first time in months, Lena Ashby felt the solid ground of her own certainty beneath her feet. Her survival was no longer a question. Now, All that remained was to endure its difficulty and to wait. 2 weeks passed. The heat did not break, it intensified. In Redemption, the talk was of the unusual severity of the summer. The well levels were dropping, and the water was beginning to taste of alkali. Tempers were short. The consensus on Lena Ashby had hardened from pity into a kind of grim justification. The canyon took her, was the phrase used, a way of absolving themselves. It was kinder to imagine a swift end than the slow, agonizing one they all knew the desert could deliver. It was Everett Shaw who broke the quarantine of their certainty. His freight route took him past the mouth of the Broken Jaw every 3 weeks. On his return journey, driven by that lingering knot of pity and a mule skinner's stubborn curiosity, he decided to look. He left his mules tethered in the shade of a rock outcropping and walked toward the canyon mouth, carrying a canteen. He expected to find nothing. Perhaps a sun-bleached bone, if the coyotes had been thorough. He found the footprints first, now part of a well-worn path from the entrance to a patch of prickly pear cactus, the fruit of which had been methodically harvested. Then he saw the entrance itself, no longer a jagged crack but a semi-formal opening, partially obscured by a hanging piece of burlap. It was the unnaturalness of it that stopped him. Nothing in this landscape was that square, that deliberate. He called her name. Lena? Mrs. Ashby? His voice was swallowed by the hot, silent air. There was no reply. He hesitated. This felt like trespassing on a grave. He was about to turn back when he felt it, a faint, cool draft coming from the opening. It was impossible. The air around him was a furnace. He put his hand to the burlap. It was damp. He pushed it aside and stepped into a world of shadow. The temperature drop was immediate and shocking, a fall of at least 20 degrees. He stood in a narrow passage, his eyes struggling to adjust. He could hear a slow, rhythmic dripping sound from somewhere deeper inside. "Lena?" he called again, his voice softer now, filled with a dawning awe. This time, she answered. Her voice came from the darkness ahead, calm and even. "Mr. Shaw, I did not expect visitors." She emerged from a deeper chamber, holding a small candle. She was thinner, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes were clear. She was not a victim. She was not a ghost. She was a woman in her own house. He was speechless. He looked around at the smooth walls, the neatly swept floor, the channel she'd carved to direct the water from the seep. He saw a small stack of firewood, a pile of harvested cactus fruit, a primitive calendar scratched into the wall. This was not a shelter. It was a homestead. How? He finally managed to ask. "My father was a well digger," she said, as if that explained everything. He stayed for an hour. She offered him a drink of the cold, clean water. He watched her check the thermometer, her face lit by the candle. She explained the principles to him in the same plain, practical terms her father had used with her. She spoke of airflow and evaporation and the steady coolness of the deep earth. He was a practical man, and he understood. What he was seeing was not magic. It was engineering. As he left, stepping back out into the brutal heat, he felt as though he were leaving a church. His pity had been replaced by a profound, humbling respect. He knew he had to keep her secret, but he also knew that secrets like this had a way of getting out. News of his visit, however garbled, reached Silas Ashby a few days later. He and Mr. Gable rode out to the canyon, their faces grim. They found the entrance easily now, thanks to Everett's tracks. Silas pushed past the burlap flap without announcing himself. "Lena." He shouted into the darkness, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. Lena appeared, her expression unreadable. "Silas, what is this?" he demanded, gesturing at the cave. "They said you were dead." "The reports were premature," she said quietly. Gable pushed forward, his eyes narrowed, trying to pierce the gloom. "You are trespassing on Ashby land, woman. This canyon is part of the original parcel." "The deed doesn't mention this cave," Lena replied. "And I am not on the land. I am in it." Silas took a step toward her, his face dark with fury. He saw her survival not as a miracle, but as an affront. a stubborn refusal to accept the verdict he and the town had passed on her. "You can't stay here," he snarled. "This is madness." "I am managing fine," she said. Gable looked from Lena's calm face to the unforgiving heat shimmering at the cave's mouth. A cold, cruel thought took root in his mind. He put a hand on Silas's arm. "Let's go, Silas." Back outside, Silas was fuming. "We can't just leave her here. It's not right." Gable turned, his face a mask of cold pragmatism. "She refuses to leave. She has found a hole to crawl into. Let the hole be her grave." He looked up at the white hot sun. "The heat will get worse. That trickle of water will dry up. Let the summer have her. It will solve the problem for good." They rode away, leaving Lena in the cool darkness, having made their cruelty plain. She had heard them. And she knew they were wrong about the water. It would not dry up. It came from too deep. The heat did not relent. It settled over the valley like a judgment. The sun rose each day not as a promise of light, but as a threat. In Redemption, the shallow town well, dug years ago in a season of plenty, began to fail. The water that came up was muddy, warm, and smelled of sulfur. Livestock, their tongues swollen, stood listlessly in the meager shade of barns that felt like ovens. Chickens died, then a cow, then another. The town's collective health began to fray. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, came down with a summer fever, her skin dry and hot to the touch. The blacksmith's youngest son, a boy of 5, grew listless and refused to eat, his breathing shallow. People's preparations, based on the memory of ordinary summers, proved fatally inadequate. They hung wet sheets in windows, but with no breeze. The sheets only added a stifling humidity to the heat. They retreated to their cellars, but the cellars were shallow, poorly ventilated, and quickly became suffocating traps. They had built their lives on the surface, and the surface had turned against them. A kind of slow-motion panic began to set in, a quiet, desperate tallying of dwindling water barrels and rising temperatures. Meanwhile, in the heart of the broken jaw, Lena Ashby's system performed flawlessly. The drip in the deep chamber remained steady, its rhythm a constant reassurance. The temperature in her sleeping quarters never rose above 74 degrees, even when the outside air climbed to a recorded 118. Her days fell into a predictable, monastic rhythm. She rose before dawn to harvest what little forage the canyon offered: prickly pear fruit, which she roasted to burn off the spines, and the starchy roots of yucca plants. She spent the hot hours in the cool darkness, mending her clothes, grinding cornmeal with a stone, and methodically expanding her living space, clearing another small chamber to use for storage. She was not merely surviving, she was comfortable. She bathed with a cloth and a small basin of cold water. She slept sound in the absolute quiet, her body cool beneath a single wool blanket. The contrast was the entire argument. The dismissed woman, the one they had written off, was living in relative ease while the established community, with all its resources and social certainties, was beginning to crumble. Their wealth was in buildings that trapped heat and a well that was failing. Her wealth was in a column of cool air and a steady trickle of water. It was knowledge applied correctly against resources applied carelessly. The night the heat reached its apex was silent and terrifying. The air did not cool after sunset. A strange, oppressive stillness fell. The moon rose into a hazy sky, and the temperature at midnight in Redemption was still 99 degrees. People slept on porches and in yards, seeking a breath of air that did not exist. That night, inside her mountain, Lena slept soundly. Before blowing out her candle, she checked her thermometer one last time. It read 72 degrees. Outside, the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The earth beneath her, however, held its cool, patient, and deep, and she slept in its embrace, unaware that her solitude was about to end. The first to come was not a supplicant, but a desperate animal. A stray dog, one of the half-wild pack that lived on the outskirts of Redemption, staggered to the mouth of her cave, its tongue lolling, its sides heaving. It collapsed on the cooler ground near the entrance, too exhausted to move. Lena found it in the morning. She approached it slowly, carrying a bowl of water. The dog watched her with wary, pain-filled eyes, but did not have the strength to snarl. It drank, long and deep, and then laid its head back on its paws and slept for a day. She named it Shade. The first human arrived 2 days later. It was Maria Sanchez, a woman whose small plot of land bordered the Ashby property. She came at dusk, carrying her 4-year-old daughter, Rosa. The child was wrapped in a wet sheet, but her skin was fiery hot, her lips were cracked, and she was frighteningly still. Maria's face was a mask of terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Everett Shaw, he told my husband. He said you had cool air. He said you had water." She had tried the town doctor, whose only advice was cool cloths and prayer. She had tried the failing well. She had tried everything she knew, and her daughter was slipping away. Lena did not hesitate. She took the child from Maria's arms. The small body was limp and unnervingly light. "Bring her inside," Lena said, her voice calm and authoritative. She led them back into the main chamber, into the heart of the cool. The effect on the child was almost immediate. The oppressive heat that had been suffocating her was lifted. Lena laid Rosa on her own cot and, with a soft cloth and a basin of the cave's cold water, began to gently sponge her face, her neck, her small limbs. She did not work with the frantic energy of a panicked mother, but with the steady, methodical competence of a nurse. She showed Maria how to do it, her voice quiet, explaining the purpose of every action. "We must bring the fever down slowly," she said. "The coolness of the air will do most of the work. Our job is just to help it along." She gave the child small sips of water, a spoonful at a time. She did not offer charity, she offered instruction. She explained to Maria why the cave stayed cool, showing her the ventilation system, the damp burlap, the deep, constant temperature of the stone. She was not saving them. She was teaching them how to save themselves. "This knowledge belongs to anyone who needs it," she said, echoing a phrase her father had often used. By morning, Rosa's fever had broken. She was weak, but she was awake and lucid, asking for more water. Maria Sanchez wept with a relief that was so profound, it was silent. She looked at Lena with eyes full of a reverence that bordered on worship. Lena would not accept it. "It is not a miracle, Maria," she said gently. "It is physics. It is something that can be learned. Word spreads through a dry land like fire." Maria's husband, after seeing his daughter safe, went back to town not with a story of magic, but with a blueprint. He told the blacksmith. He told his brother. He told them about thermal mass and ventilation. He told them that Lena Ashby was not a witch or a ghost, but a woman who understood how the world worked. The next day, 3 more families arrived. The blacksmith was among them, his own son now showing the same terrifying symptoms Rosa had. Lena took them all in. The cave was suddenly crowded, the silence broken by the whispers of anxious parents and the fretful cries of sick children. She organized them. She put the men to work clearing another chamber, expanding their living space. She put the women to work managing the water, keeping the cooling cloths damp, and caring for the sick. She became the quiet center of a growing community, a refugee camp organized around a single, life-giving principle. She taught every person who came not just what to do, but why it worked, insisting that they understand. The knowledge that saves only its holder is knowledge poorly used. She was no longer just surviving, she was leading. The reckoning, when it came, was not with a storm of righteous anger, but with the quiet arrival of a wagon in the punishing midday heat. It was Silas Ashby. His wife, Martha, sat beside him, holding their own listless son, a boy of 6 named Thomas after his late uncle. Martha's face was a ruin of pride and desperation. Silas would not meet Lena's eyes. He stood beside the wagon, a man broken by the same forces he had been so sure would dispose of his sister-in-law. "He's sick," Silas said to the air. His voice choked. The doctor, there's nothing he can do. The fever won't break. He had come here last. He had exhausted every other option. Coming to the woman he had dispossessed, the woman he had willingly left to die, was the final, most humiliating station of his cross. From the mouth of the cave, Maria Sanchez and the blacksmith watched, their faces hard. They had been saved by this woman. They felt a surge of protective anger toward the man who had wronged her. But Lena emerged from the cool darkness and walked toward the wagon, her expression calm and unreadable. She looked at the sick child, then at Martha's tear-streaked face. She said nothing of their last meeting, of Gable's cruel pronouncement. She simply said, "Bring him inside." Silas lifted his son into his arms. The boy whimpered. As Silas stepped across the threshold from the searing heat into the cave's cool air, the relief was so profound, so absolute, that he nearly stumbled. It was like stepping from hell into a kind of grace he knew he did not deserve. Lena treated Thomas Ashby exactly as she had treated Rosa Sanchez and the blacksmith's boy. She gave him a place on a pallet, began the slow, methodical process of cooling his body, and offered his parents sips of the cold, clean water. She spoke to Martha with the same quiet authority she had used with Maria, explaining the process, teaching her. The equality of the treatment was the verdict. She offered no recriminations, no "I told you so." She did not need to. The cave itself was the judgment. The cool, life-giving air was the evidence. Her quiet, impartial competence was the final word. Silas sat on a rock in the main chamber, a man hollowed out. He watched her move, her every action efficient and purposeful. He saw the community she had built from nothing. The people who looked to her not as a savior, but as a teacher. He saw the respect in the eyes of Everett Shaw, who had arrived with a load of supplies, flour, salt, beans, donated by the families she had already saved. He finally understood. He had tried to take her house, her land, her name. He had left her with nothing. But he had not been able to take the one thing of value she truly possessed, her knowledge. That afternoon, as the heat finally broke in a torrent of monsoon rain, Mr. Gable arrived. His wife had taken a turn for the worse. He found a community in the cave. He found Silas Ashby, his partner in cruelty, humbly tending to his son under Lena Ashby's direction. Gable stood at the entrance, his authority rendered meaningless. He asked for help. Lena gave it to him, with the same impartial grace. The vindication was not in their humiliation, but in their inclusion. They were all just people, made equal by their vulnerability to the heat, and saved by the same simple, elegant truth. By the time the rains had cooled the valley, the story of the cave was the founding myth of a new redemption. The testimony of the families she had saved, sworn before a traveling magistrate, was irrefutable. The old deed, the old debt, were set aside by a consensus so powerful it needed no courtroom. The land, and the cave within it, was declared hers by a right far more fundamental than any scribbled ledger, the right of earned survival. The years that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm. The summer of the great heat became a benchmark, a story told to children. Lena Ashby's cave, which came to be known as Lena's Cool, became a local landmark, a place of pilgrimage for those who wanted to understand. She never left it. The adobe house she had lost was a distant memory, a symbol of a life lived on the fragile surface of things. Her true home was in the heart of the mountain. Everett Shaw became her constant companion. He never moved into the cave, but his freight route always ended there. He was her window to the world, bringing news, books, and the occasional traveler curious to see the place for themselves. Theirs was a partnership built not on romance, but on a foundation of shared, quiet respect. He admired her competence, and she his steadfast loyalty. He helped her improve the cave, building wooden shelves, a proper door for the entrance, and a clever system of mirrors to reflect sunlight into the main passage. The knowledge, as she had promised, was for anyone who wanted it. She taught the people of Redemption how to build better. She showed them how to site their houses to take advantage of morning shade, how to build thick adobe walls that could absorb the day's heat and radiate it out at night, how to create cooling breezeways and dig deep, properly ventilated cellars. The town, humbled by its near-death experience, listened. The new buildings that went up were a testament to her influence, a hybrid of traditional construction and her father's deep earth wisdom. A reporter from a Phoenix newspaper came one year, having heard the story. He wanted to write a sensational piece about the hermit woman of the canyon. He found instead a serene, articulate woman who spoke about thermodynamics with the simple clarity of a master craftsman. He offered her money for her story, a chance at fame. She quietly declined. "The knowledge isn't mine to sell," she told him. "It belongs to the earth. I just paid attention." The article he wrote was not sensational. It was a thoughtful, reverent piece about resilience and practical wisdom that was reprinted in papers as far away as Chicago. Over the years, the figures from that first summer moved on. The Gables, their reputation in Redemption ruined, sold their store and moved west. Silas Ashby, a changed and humbled man, worked his brother's land for a decade before moving his family to a greener state, but not before he came to the cave one last time to thank her. His son, Thomas, had grown into a healthy young man. Maria Sanchez's daughter, Rosa, became a teacher and told the story of Lena's Cool to a new generation of children. Everett Shaw grew old with her, their conversations a long, comfortable thread woven through the years. He died peacefully in his sleep one winter, and Lena buried him on a gentle slope overlooking the canyon, marking the spot with a smooth river stone. Lena herself lived to be 84. She became the valley's matriarch, its conscience, its memory. She died in her sleep on a warm March night, in her own bed, in the cool, quiet heart of the cave. The people of Redemption buried her beside Everett, under the vast, quiet sky. Decades passed. The town of Redemption slowly withered, a victim of new highways and changing economies. By the 1950s, it was little more than a ghost town. A group of university students researching desert architecture stumbled upon the ruins. They found the cave by accident, following a set of worn stone steps. The wooden door had rotted away, but when they stepped inside, they were met by a palpable, astonishing coolness. The air was still, the stone walls felt cold to the touch, and deep within, they could hear the slow, steady drip of water. The system, after all those years, was still working. On a dusty shelf, they found a small, brass-cased thermometer, its glass tube still intact. The thin red line rested on 72 degrees. It was a final, wordless confirmation of a life lived not in defiance of the world, but in deep and profound agreement with it.